Hello everyone, I am Anthropomantic Fiend, and welcome back to Flights of Fancy. Again, if you're not familiar with this, or if you're not familiar with my channel, I usually do horror-related things on the internet, but this is my series of videos where I talk about one of my other passions, which is the fantasy genre. And typically when I do my horror reviews, what got me started was finding cheap box sets, a lot of time put out by Echo Bridge or Mill Creek, of horror movies, and reviewing all of the movies in those box sets and finding a lot of lesser known movies to talk about that way. I came across a box set of fantasy and adventure movies put out by Hallmark and Echo Bridge, obviously two of the finest purveyors of entertainment, and I decided I wanted to do the same thing for this fantasy series because I've barely done any videos in it. I've done 2 prior to this one. And some of the movies I'm going to talk about are going to be more adventure than they are fantasy, but I'm going to be doing them in this series anyway because they're in the box set. But the one I'm talking about today is very, very much a fantasy movie. And that is Merlin's Apprentice from 2006. And it is technically like everything in the box set, even though it says 4 films on the cover, a mini-series. So it has already taken up much of my day to watch the 2 hour and 30-minute segments. But I will be talking about whether or not it was worth it right now. Merlin's Apprentice was directed by David Wu, who also directed Snow Queen, The Bride with the White Hair 2, and Cold Steel, and he was the editor on such movies as Bride of Chucky and Brotherhood of the Wolf. This stars the legendary Sam Neill, who was in such amazing things as Jurassic Park, Event Horizon, and my personal favorite, In the Mouth of Madness. Miranda Richardson, who was in Sleepy Hollow. She was fantastic in Sleepy Hollow, as well as The Crying Game and Snow White, the Fairest of Them All. John Reardon, who was in Scary Movie 4, The Thing Below, and Tron Legacy. And Megan Ori, who was in the Once Upon a Time TV show, which I kind of fell off of watching, but have very fond memories of watching and would like to revisit at some point, as well as Dead Rising, Watchtower, and Dark House. And this is loosely, I believe, meant to be a sequel to the Merlin miniseries that came out prior, like in 1990-something. And I'm pretty sure I've actually seen that one before, and may very well have seen this entire thing a long time ago. It works pretty well on its own. I decided to review it on its own, but if you would like to hear me review that prior mini-series of Merlin, also with Sam Neill, let me know. I was actually staying with my family in a log cabin during December of 2020. They had a selection of DVDs to choose from on the shelf, and we ended up watching some of those. One of them was Merlin's Apprentice, and I was like, ooh, Sam Neill. So we watched part of it, didn't finish it whatsoever. I wasn't that blown away by it, but I enjoyed what I had seen, so I was happy to revisit it now. And the plot is that Merlin has, after seeing to it that the Holy Grail and King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table are all in their rightful place and doing well, and Camelot is thriving, he's like, time for a nap, and then accidentally goes to sleep for 50 years. And then he wakes up and comes back to find his friends dead. Everything is not literally in ruins, but not in the state he would like it to be in. And the Grail is gone. So he has to try and make things right. And at the same time, there is this thief named Jack who sneaks into Camelot and decides, ooh, I'm gonna steal Merlin's wand. He also has some very like middling magical powers that usually go awry. So he's like, you know what, I'm gonna stick to the stealing thing for the most part. So he tries to steal a magic wand from Merlin. The two of them spar, and even though Jack is still clearly kind of a bumbling idiot, Merlin sees something in him. There's this wild vision of the Holy Grail that happens, and Merlin's like, okay, there's something going on here, clearly. You know what? I'm going to teach you to do magic, and hopefully you can assist me and the rest of the court at Camelot in retrieving the Grail and stopping this impending war with this other foreign king that's about to happen. Also, the Lady of the Lake is a villain and is urging on the foreign king. Also, just a heads up, this and every other movie review I'm going to be doing from here on out, whether it's Heart of the Night reviews or Flights of Fancy, is probably going to be very spoiler heavy, and it's all just going to be mixed in. There's not going to be a spoiler section, just because that helps me talk about the movie and my thoughts a little bit more freely. So I would recommend checking this one out if you can. If you do not want it spoiled for you, I would recommend going ahead and doing that and then coming back and watching this video. The score for Merlin's Apprentice was done by Lawrence Schrag. I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but Lawrence also did the scores for David Wu's Snow Queen, Viper, and Killer Contractor, which has to be interesting, as well as a lot of other Christmas projects that looked very, very hallmarky. It's a very traditional, majestic, fantasy-sounding score. Nothing about it really stood out to me. Between the swelling orchestral stuff and these little more folky-sounding bits that were fun, I really enjoyed it, and I thought it suited the movie. Not much to write home about, but I enjoyed it. Visually, I like this movie as well. The natural settings, from the forests to the fields to the streams to just all of it that they used, they're very pretty. Nothing I can really pinpoint there, but it's just pretty looking nature, and I liked it. The sets and costumes have like a degree of artifice to them, but they're overall pretty nice looking and suit the medieval fantasy vibe, and that degree of artifice that they have just adds to the charm for me, and they made me want to go to the Ren Fair, so I need to look into when that's happening this summer. Character-wise, Sam Neill, great actor, works perfectly as Merlin. He's got this very sort of serious, steadfast, wise old man vibe to him, even though he's not the old bearded Merlin that most people are probably going to think of. He feels very sturdy and determined when he needs to be, but can also bring this touch of humor to the character of Merlin that I thought worked really well. I really, really like him in that respect as kind of the grumpy, begrudging teacher of Jack, because he's kind of antagonizing him in these little ways whenever he can. The first time he sees Jack breaking into his home and trying to steal his wand, and Jack's like, hey, we both have magic powers. I'll show you some new stuff and you can show me some of the classics. And he's like, all right, how is this for a classic? And literally just turns him into a frog and throws him against the door. So this Merlin takes absolutely no shit, and I appreciate that. I do appreciate that they bring some nuance to the character. He's not always kind of one step ahead of everybody. He's been asleep for some years, and he's a little oblivious to what's going on, and he's a little bit set in his old ways. So there's this confrontation with the character of Yvonne, who's kind of expected to be the next lady of Camelot and marry this lord and bear children, and Merlin's kind of going along with that and kind of pressuring her into that, and knows of this affair she's been having outside of her expected impending marriage to the Lord and kind of shames her for that. And the ghost of King Arthur literally shows up to be like, dude, you don't know what you're talking about, shut up. And then Merlin's vision is over and he's, saying I'm sorry about it for the rest of his time in the movie. I liked that there's this nuance to him, and he's wise and he has this old wisdom, but he doesn't always know what's going on, and he doesn't always have exactly the right outlook on the situation, and he will have to second guess himself sometimes. So that was good. The group of villains, these foreign barbarians that seem vaguely Celtic, of course the villains are foreign barbarians in animal skins. It does feel suited to what this is because it's an Arthurian story that is very much told from the perspective of the English, and a lot of the traditional Arthurian stuff would be foreigners, scary. That is not an outlook I share. So it's kind of eye roll worthy because this other group of people are depicted as completely unredeemable villains, very kind of just primitive and feral and over the top. They might as well have been like orcs in a Tolkien something or other. Most everything else, even the Lady of the Lake, in my opinion, has some nuance to it. I don't really see much of any nuance to this other group of foreigners that they're fighting, except in one like minor little way that I might get into in story stuff. And I do really like Miranda Richardson as the Lady of the Lake. She's very just kind of ethereal and there, and she doesn't do a lot, but you get the sense that she's always pulling the strings, and she's just kind of very elegant and unshakable, and I liked that. What I wasn't as big on is there's this effect that they're using on Miranda Richardson's voice that makes it feel kind of otherworldly and like kind of almost mechanical. It's like doubling it and making it sound weird. I don't know quite else how to describe it, but it makes it clear that she's an otherworldly being, but it feels just a little bit distracting to me. And I was curious why she's even the villain of this piece, because traditionally she's the one who gives the sword to King Arthur, even though this kind of implies that he pulled it out of the stone. I don't know. This thing is kind of loose with its Arthurian legend. She's seen as this powerful figure of good. You would usually expect the villain to be someone like, I don't know, Mordred or Morgana, Morgan Le Fay, or I think the other Merlin miniseries had Queen Mab of the fairies, who's like this dark being in that as the villains. This one has it as the Lady of the Lake. And I actually really like that decision because one, that allows her to manipulate water, and that is utilized well in many instances. And also, she's kind of got this like environmental motivation going on where she's like, Camelot contaminated my waters in order to poison their enemies, but they've kind of just corrupted this land to their own ends anyway after I entrusted them with it. So I'm going to destroy what they built because they are destroying my domain, essentially. She doesn't feel outright evil. She feels just like she's a force of nature, almost, even though I think this thing's actual intent is for her just to be evil. She feels more like just this fluid force of nature. So she's like environmentally motivated, almost in kind of like this like Batman's poison ivy way that feels kind of valid, but then she's just doing a lot more damage that also feels like it's also hurting the environment. So, I still thought she was cool, and I liked the concept of her character, and I thought she worked well as a villain. So Jack has significant character growth throughout this thing, from at the beginning being an absolute idiot who is just bumbling his way through being a wizard and a thief, to being just this very determined, gritty hero by the end of this thing. But at the beginning, he's like trying to pickpocket one of the camps of these Celts, and he barely escapes with his life, and then he barely escapes execution at the hands of the guards of Camelot, and then he literally gets turned into a toad and thrown against the wall. My question is, yes, he becomes this badass later, but how has he survived this long to begin with? Like, where has he been? Who has he been pickpocketing? How miserable and oblivious do these people have to be in order to be so easily pickpocketed by him? How has he survived? And then Jack, as a character, doesn't have too many other nuances to him besides both having just this heart of gold and also just this rascally, both boastful and kind of self-deprecating streak that he's picked up from being a thief his entire life. The thing that really makes him interesting is all of the like moral dilemmas he has to face, where he has to either go along with what Merlin is saying or betray Merlin in order to assist the lord of the castle. And there are multiple times in this where he does what he thinks is right, and it ends up screwing him or someone else that he cares about over. I generally thought it was very well done because a lot of the time there's this sense of unease and questioning, but usually you can see where he's coming from and get why he at least thinks what he's doing is right. And to some degree, you might be on board with him too. There's also a great scene where he has to talk to the character of Yvonne because she's about to jump off a cliff for reasons, and he shows this very vulnerable side of himself that he hasn't before. And even shortly after that, after he's like, oh, I led some people to their deaths, he's very hard on himself, and instead of opening up, he just gets super drunk and is an absolute asshole. And he's very kind of sarcastically self-deprecating himself while declaring himself the greatest magician of all time. Brian slash Brianna, who I will get into, is trying to like comfort him, and he's just giggling and being very harsh at the same time. And it's like this fall from grace for him that's kind of played for laughs, but also not. It's interesting. I'm not sure if I like it or not, but it's interesting. But this earlier scene where he's talking to Yvonne has him being more vulnerable than I feel he is in any other part of the movie. And it's this great speech that I think is a highlight of the film. And then there is Squire Brian, aka Brianna, who is someone who I was like, oh, okay, so they're gonna do the like Shakespearean but not as good woman disguised as a man in order to make ends meet for herself storyline, which ended up being exactly what it is. And I did not like the way they chose to reveal that, which was having Jack, who's about to get killed by Brian slash Brianna, put a love spell on her, and she like reveals herself and is like, I'm actually Brianna and I'm madly in love with you now. It just feels kind of icky to me, and I didn't like it. I very much wanted this character to just be Brian and be trans, which I knew was not going to happen, but I would have liked it. There's just this very much this energy to the character that feels in line with the kind of gender bending that happens in Shakespeare's stuff like Twelfth Night and the character of Éowyn in Lord of the Rings, who disguises herself as a male soldier to do pretty much exactly what Brian slash Brianna is doing, albeit Brianna is doing it for significantly longer. And then inevitably, of course, there's a romance between them, and I'm deciding that it's queer because I say so, but also there's like this tiny little moment between Brianna and Yvonne that feels like it should be the start of a romance to me, but also I'm looking at this through a very, very not straight, personally, lens. Even though I literally don't feel romantic or sexual attraction anyway. Every time there's just like, traditional heterosexual romance, it's just like, okay, this again. I have nothing else to contribute to that statement. I do really, really like Brianna as a character. She feels very much like the strong female character in the way Éowyn is in Lord of the Rings. Not quite as well developed, but she has these really, really great moments. And there's a moment where I'm still kind of, wishing that she just got to be Brian and be this trans character. But she and Jack kiss in front of Yvonne and her boyfriend, and they try to be like, no, nothing's happening, you didn't see anything, and they're like, oh yeah, cool, our best swordsman is actually a woman, cool, this is revolutionary, this is actually awesome, and they're very accepting of it, and that was cool. So there is kind of this lightly somewhat feminist streak to the movie that I appreciate, but I was just like, of course they're doing the woman in man's clothing storyline here that is inevitably going to, end in exactly the romance I'm expecting and dreading. But again, much like with my last review in this series, this is a Hallmark movie. What was I expecting? But Brian's not a perfect strong character either. I'm going to keep referring to this character as both Brian and Brianna because I think both work. And I want this character to be queer so desperately. So I'm just deciding that they are. Screw you. Brian ends up killing these characters who they were, keeping alive, although they had, betrayed the entire group and completely screwed over Yvonne. They're kind of awful people. And so the Lord was just going to execute them on sight. But Jack was like, no, we have to keep them alive in order for the Grail to reveal itself to us. If we have this much blood on our hands, nothing is going to happen for us. And then Brianna is like, you know what? Actually, I'm just going to kill them while nobody's looking because they're awful people and I hate their guts. And also, Camelot has already been kind of destroyed. So I don't care. We're already screwed. They shouldn't be alive anymore. And you can very much see the perspective of both Jack, who's still holding on to what little hope they have left, and Brian, who's just like, you know what? We're already in this point. There's already blood on so many people's hands here, whether it's actual blood from killing someone or just shitty decisions. So I don't think they should be alive. And you can very much see both perspectives, and it creates this great conflict between them. My favorite character in this movie, though, is Sir Snout. Technically, his name is actually Pig. He's literally just a pig, but in the very first scene he appears in, Jack refers to him as Sir Snout, and I think that's adorable, so that is the name I'm going to be continuing to use for him. And there's kind of a throwaway line that happens where Merlin says something to the effect of, to this enchanter we're going to be encountering, the magic that you possess might as well just be the magic of mice or voles, which made me think, so do mice and voles just innately have magic in them? Is this the case with all animals? Is Sir Snout magic? And as it happens, literally nothing happens until the very end of the movie, but yes, he is. There's a scene at the end of the movie where Sir Snout just happens to be able to talk. This has not come up at any other point in the movie. I think it's kind of hilarious, but also very out of keeping with the tone of the movie. Yes, there's humor, and humor that's somewhat whimsical with magic, but this thing also gets very dark and gritty, and the sudden appearance of a talking pig at the end of the movie feels very out of place. But I don't care that much. And then we find out that the pig has also been talking to Brianna at the end. And I'll talk about that more when we talk about story stuff. But apparently Sir Snout actually is magic. So that throwaway line does sort of pay off by the end, which is cool, I guess. And also, this is not really anything that's that funny, but Pig and Voice of Pig are two different listings in the credits, which is not something I would have necessarily expected. I was like, oh yeah, they have a pig, and they have either actually mic'd this pig somehow, or they have, stock pig sound effects. But no, they had a different pig voicing this pig. Was what I thought when I was originally... I'm such an idiot. Part 1, Sir Snout does exactly nothing. So I was like, oh, this is interesting. They have a voice for the pig. This pig has said nothing, so they just have a different pig overdubbing this pig. I'm an idiot. That listing was for the person who does the actual voice of the pig in part 2, which does not come up, so it's fair that I was confused, but looking back at my notes now, wow. Okay, never mind. But yes, Sir Snout, best character in the movie. Yvonne is another major player in this, and again, she's like this lady who's, I think, the granddaughter of Sir Gawain, or at least by the end, that is brought into question, but she is a noble, and she is expected to carry on the legacy of Camelot by producing more kids, basically. And she is, like, horribly ostracized by Merlin initially, and then pretty much everybody else in their group. to the point where she ends up going to this cliff and trying to kill herself, and Jack has to talk her out of that. However, at that point, I was just like, I very much want to see Yvonne just go on a killing spree because I have to imagine there's just so much rage in her, and that never really fully pays itself off. But we do get to see her kind of come into her own a little bit more. We get to see this flashback of her as a small child being raised by these two other members of the court who are definitely not related to Sir Gawain and are apparently her actual parents and who have been treating her like shit. She ends up breaking up a fight between Brian and her boyfriend, who's important but whose name I have forgotten. And she feels very determined in that and then doesn't take much action again for a while. But then after Jack kind of reaches into her past with his magic and she realizes that she's not actually descended from the people she thought she was, she confronts them. And again, she doesn't even like get in on the actual like fantasy action aspect of the movie, but she is a bit of a badass in her own way, and I really like her. I don't like seeing her just get yanked around and being miserable for most of the movie, but I do really like her character. And the lord that all of this is happening under is Lord Weston, who I have kind of hated from the outset. The movie kind of tries to pass him off as the next King Arthur, but I kind of knew he was a shithead from the start. He just feels very self-absorbed and is always talking about regaining the glory of Camelot, but always in terms of, I have to get the Grail. He always just felt very self-centered and authoritarian, and even if he did to some degree have the interests of other people at heart, he was, pushing other people aside and, letting them die in order to, as I think Jack says, just personally vindicate himself by being able to get the Grail, which is why the Grail will not show itself to him. Because they keep talking about, like, what is the stain on Camelot that is making us tainted and unable to get the Grail because we're impure. One of my favorite lines is when Brianna says, there is no stain on a Camelot, it is all stain. But as we find out, Lord Weston is the stain on Camelot. And for a while, I was just like, are they just gonna make him kind of this very kind of macho authoritarian ruler guy and we're going to be okay with that? But ultimately they do address his selfishness, and Jack says, you're the stain on Camelot. He tries to take the Grail anyway, and it Raiders of the Lost Arks him, basically, minus the absolutely horrifying face-melting effects that traumatized me when I was younger, but basically does the same thing to him. But yeah, he's the Lord, he's the steward to the throne since Arthur is absent, and if Lord of the Rings has taught me anything, it's not to trust the steward. Even though I saw through it the whole time, I kind of liked that they had him positioned as, oh, this is the good guy, this is the guy who's leading us into battle, and it's these other dissenters within court that are making this a problem. Again, even though I knew it the whole time, I appreciate that they were like, wait, nope, this guy's selfish and egotistical and actually not the ideal of a king at all. I hate him, but I like what they did with his character. Story-wise, this is set up as like this very big traditional battle between good and evil, and I was like, is there going to be any nuance to this at all? Or is it just going to be like, good guys, bad guys, clash? And I would have been able to have fun with that. But it turns out there is more nuance to that, and I also appreciate that it is this grand-scale battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and on this very grand magical scale, kind of spearheaded by Merlin in one corner and the Lady of the Lake in the other, and that kind of intersects with the wants of these much smaller characters like Jack, who is just a thief who wants to survive onto the next day, and Brian, who is a squire and wants to be a knight. And those characters end up getting elevated into something much greater by the end of this. And kind of in the middle tier, sitting between huge magical conflict and these kind of lower class-ish characters who are just trying to make it. You've got all of the drama that's happening in the court with the Lord and with Yvonne and all of those characters, and all of that intersects eventually. But I liked that it starts from these disparate places. I do think that Merlin accepts Jack as his apprentice a little bit too readily at first, but then later on he does like second guess himself, and we do get that moment of doubt, so I'm glad they went back on that. Even if you're like literally presented with a vision of the Grail, I don't think you're immediately going to be like, yes, okay, this is fine. I'm going to have this guy who broke into my house and tried to steal my stuff be my apprentice now. But I do appreciate that there is some doubt in there. There's a moment where Jack uses Sir Snout to get himself over the wall using some kind of pulley thing, and it's just edited in such a way that I literally don't know how he used Sir Snout to get himself over the wall, so if you can explain that to me, it would be great. And the overall kind of theme of this movie and the overall like core dilemma it's exploring is what really made this work for me, which is Camelot's in a shitty position. Characters like Jack and Brian are in shitty positions because of where they are on kind of the scale of things. Everybody's stuck in a place where they don't want to be. And the question it is kind of asking is like, do we keep reaching for the past and the glory of what things used to be? Do we accept the present? Or do we try to build a new future? And the overall message does seem to be just refusing the shitty position that the world is sticking you in. Although there are huge moments of doubt within that, obviously, as previously discussed, when Brianna is just like, yep, this sucks, murder time. But I like that that's the core message, and that they have to be like, okay, so if the present sucks and we need to change that, are we just going to try to rebuild things the way they used to be, or are we going to try to build a new future? And they try to rebuild and relive the glory days of Camelot for most of the movie. And the main conflict seems to be, oh, either we have to accept that the present day sucks, or hold on to this past ideal of Camelot and try to find a new Arthur and a new Merlin and restore the Grail, which they low-key sort of kind of do by the end, but ultimately the message that it's putting forward is actually we need to rebuild a better future because Arthur's gone, Merlin's gone, Merlin dies, but these are the people who are here now. No, Camelot is not going to be what it was before. I do not know how long it took them to rebuild everything because, like, it's literally in ruins at one point, and then they're just like, oh, everything's better now. But they do make a point of saying, actually, we are going to, have a semblance of the structure that was there before, but we are building a new future based on what we have now. We're in a shitty situation, but we have good people who know what they're doing, and we're going to figure out a way to fix this. And so overall, I thought that was a good ethos for the movie to have. Going more into specific events in the movie, there's one really fun scene earlier on where Merlin is putting Jack to the test and is like, okay, are you hungry? What's the food you most desire in this moment? And he's like, a rhubarb pie. And Merlin's like, a rhubarb pie. And he conjures up this rhubarb pie that, like, Jack is clearly drooling over, and, like, Merlin's really hyping it up. And he's just like, you need to control yourself, and you need to find this magical ring that's hidden within. And if you think that you can so much as lift up the crust and steal away a small piece of the ambrosia within, think again. And he's just really laying it on thick and making Jack drool over this thing as much as possible, and it's really funny. And I had to just write down in my notes, who would win, a foolish but potent wizard in training or one rhubarb pie? It does end up being the wizard in training, but I would not have been surprised if the rhubarb pie won first. I would have loved to see more examples of him having just these stupid trial and error moments while trying to train with Merlin. There's also a point where they have to go through this passage that's been blocked off with spells put on it by Merlin, and Jack's figured out how to undo them, and Brian wants to go through in order to prove himself as a knight because he's done some stuff that has kind of knocked him down a few rungs of the status ladder. Brianna's like, I need some glory to get back my chance at honor. And so they go out and they do something valiant and they drag back somebody behind them on a horse and they go in and everybody's celebrating them. And it's this really quick cut. And it's just like that act of glory slash honor sure did happen fast. I really don't know what you actually did, except maybe you fought with some of the Celts that are currently attacking you. But what you actually did is very vague and feels cut out of the movie. What happened? The fight scenes in this are pretty well choreographed. Most of them aren't focused on that heavily, especially in the battle at the very end of part one. It's just kind of like, this is happening, I guess. And then there's like dramatic character moments happening within the battle. But there are moments of one-on-one combat that I think are amazingly choreographed. One of them is between Brian slash Brianna and Yvonne's boyfriend, whose name I'm still forgetting. And it's very, very tense, actually, because until Yvonne breaks it up, you do think one of them is going to kill the other. And it's choreographed in this way where it feels very chaotic, and it's not just this very clean sword fighting. There's blades that break, people are holding things at weird angles. It just works really well. There's also a lot of slow-mo that happens in this that sometimes feels dramatically appropriate, like when Merlin dies, and then there's just like a huge montage of all these previous moments that he had shared with Jack. It's a little bit over the top, but it feels appropriate for this. But other moments, including the battle sequence at the very beginning of part two, it feels a little bit silly, but I enjoyed it. They end up making Jack the son of the Lady of the Lake and Merlin, which I didn't love. Like, I see why they do it, so that he has a connection with both Merlin and the Lady of the Lake, and it ends up being a plot point later where the Lady of the Lake leads him astray and he tries to call on Merlin from the dead, and the Lady of the Lake actually is the one that responds and sends him a vision of the Grail that ends up leading some of the knights to their death. It's not a false vision of the Grail, which I thought was interesting, but it does end up screwing some of Jack's side over. And I also almost got the sense that there is no way to counterfeit the Grail in a vision because it's such a pure, true thing, so that worked for me. I do, however, think that making Jack the son of the Lady of the Lake and Merlin, one, implies that the two of them had a relationship, which feels kind of weird to me, and also I feel like undercuts the fact that he came from such an ordinary background, because I like the idea of him just being like a guy who grew up in poverty who happens to possess this inner spark that ends up saving so many people, rather than them being like, actually, your parents were really powerful and high up there. I much more prefer the idea of him coming from a completely ordinary background and then doing all of this amazing stuff, but I see why it was there as a plot point, and it does end up playing into other things later, so I don't mind that much. And in the battle scene that happens right before part two, things just escalate really fast, like the wall gets broken down, all of these Celts just swarm in and start killing people, and Merlin builds a huge bridge out of the wall of the castle. It's very over the top and dramatic, as is everything in this. But prior to this, it's mostly just been like seeing a few bits and pieces of the oncoming Celts, and then a lot of like intrigue and drama within the court at Camelot, and Brian trying to be a knight, and Jack trying to be a wizard, and it's all just a little bit smaller scale and contained within Camelot. And then as soon as this battle kind of comes out of left field at the end, everything's in ruins, and part two feels like almost apocalyptic because everything's destroyed, everyone's on the run, and it just goes from 0 to 11 really fast in a way that's kind of jarring, but again, it kind of works for me. We do ultimately find out that Camelot is the reason this war started to begin with. I do love that, again, there's a lot of nuance to it, and that there is corruption within the court of Camelot, and they're not just completely good and pure. One of my favorite lines in this is, "It doesn't matter what we were, all that matters is what we became." I think that is a great line, which is said in response to Brianna, who's like, the world has gone to shit. And then she's like, well, actually, that's really sweet and all, Jack, but I did just kill 2 people, so have fun processing that new information. But it is just a great line on its own. And then the ending of this thing, I ultimately love where it winds up, which is with Yvonne's then boyfriend, I think. No, I don't think it's him. It's somebody else who picks up the torch. I don't know. I don't remember. Whoever it is who's going to be the next king and who holds up the grail is like, we're going to rebuild a new Camelot, not bound by our recent past, but by the future we all design, which, again, they lean into that being the answer, which I think is fantastic. But at the same time, they kill off characters who I love. I thought that they had killed off Brian at one point, and I was really mad about that. Turns out Brianna does not die, but I do believe Yvonne and her boyfriend do die, and I was like, why did you kill them? There was no good reason to kill them. You've already killed a bunch of other characters, why'd you kill them? But there is kind of a morbid poetry to their death, because they do get impaled on this giant spike, and there's just a silhouetted image of them sitting together, kind of embracing with a big spike through them. Not really the ending I wanted to see for them, especially because Yvonne tried to kill herself earlier and got talked out of that and had risen to this high height, and they end up killing her anyway. But there is something darkly poetic about the ending that her character ends up getting. And then at the end, Sir Snout comes back. Jack is looking at this memorial for Merlin, and he's like, I wish this thing had roots in the land of the dead so that I might speak to you, Father. And then the pig just walks over and is like, you can. You just need to say the name of the place, which I think is Tartarus, which sounds a lot like Tartarus, which is the fiery hell pit from Greek mythology. But ultimately, he does end up, going and talking to Merlin and being like, oh, the pig told me. And Merlin being like, still, that was really powerful magic. Good to see you for a moment, son. My main question is, with the Holy Grail being such a crux of this, and it being this very Christian piece of iconography, what is the mythology this world is based on? Because, I know Arthurian legends, draws from pagan stuff, but in its best known form with the Holy Grail and all of that, it's very much shaped by Christianity, and the Holy Grail is a very Christian item. So the fact that there's a different land of the dead, I'm totally down with there being a different land of the dead and them not subscribing to heaven and hell, but it's kind of confusing given that one of the cruxes of the story is a very Christian piece of iconography that holds wild and amazing powers. I also find that the destruction of the Lady of the Lake happens way too quickly. She just kind of appears in the cavern next to Jack and tries to dissuade him from taking the grail, and then he just kind of obliterates her with a magic blast. And given all the strings she's been pulling this whole time, it feels very anticlimactic for her character. But my headcanon is that she's just still kind of somewhere in the atmosphere at all times. She never was really destroyed. I don't think the Lady of the Lake can be destroyed. But the movie, I don't know if it feels the same way, and I feel kind of weird about that being the ending for her character. Also, the very ending is showing the happy home of Brianna and Jack together in their nice little heterosexual relationship, and Brian being like, oh, so yeah, I knew the pig could talk too, and the pig told me that right now is a great time for sowing the seeds of the coming harvest, and it's this very heavy-handed implication of sex. And then Jack is like, what the pig says goes, and blows out the candle, and it cuts to the credits. And given all the dramatic stuff that happens in this thing, it's just that's the note you want to end this whole thing on? Okay, again, Hallmark. Not sure what I was expecting, but wow. And then the effects in this are kind of cheesy, low-budget CGI, but they kind of relegate them to places where they don't feel that tacky. There's implications of sea monsters under the surface when these people try to retrieve the grail, but the Lady of the Lake's actually luring them into a trap. But it's just a few little swishes of a tail, and you don't really see that much of it. And the magic itself is very obviously CG, but when it's just blasts of light or one conjuration of a rhubarb pie or something, it doesn't feel that tacky or out of place. It's definitely better than what was in The Curse of King Tut's tomb. So overall, I actually really liked this one. It made me want to both go to the Ren Fair and dive into other Arthurian media that I really like. If you're a fan of Sam Neill or Miranda Richardson or Arthurian legend or medieval fantasy in general, this thing is not the best example of any of those things, but it is a lot of fun. And if you have some time to watch 2 hour and 30-minute segments, maybe don't watch them all in one day like I did, but they are worth watching, and I think they're a lot of fun. I don't know if these are streaming anywhere else right now, but definitely out there, and I'm expecting not that hard to access, so I would recommend checking it out. That is my review of Merlin's Apprentice. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!